Hitting some buttons here. Just want to take this opportunity to allow people to take a moment and ask some questions. I know we've been bombing along at a pretty good pace, but if you're back on the line and you want to stop and ask a question before we move on to the second session, part of the session, then please take your mute off and jump in now. Okay. All right. Moving forward, let's jump back to the presentation. Okay, so in part one, we specifically talked about the 11 guidelines. Some things that you can do. You can audit your internal documents and practices. Take a look at it and say, how do we do these things? And do they fit into the 11 practices of ethics and standards? You can take a look at your service agreements and the documents that you use, your employment agreements, and ask whether or not everything that you do is consistent with the Code of Ethics and Standards. You can create templates for job postings to make sure that 90% or 80% of what goes up in the internet every day or onto your job boards are accurate and professional. Heck, now you can use AI now to do that, to make sure that they're grammatically correct and formatted properly. Provide thorough training of your employees to ensure their awareness of their legal and professional obligations. So it doesn't just stop with you, but you can promote this from within. You can promote a culture that influences the treatment of all candidates and employees without prejudice, and that protects their privacy and is open and fair. You can create a code of ethics or operating guidelines for your own self that goes to a higher standard and ensure the awareness and adherence of all of that. And of course, we want to post at minimum, post the Access Code of Ethics and Standards in your office and on your websites. So let's talk about some guidelines and business practices in managing your business that will be helpful. It goes beyond just the 11 principles. So these operating guidelines are important because when things are put in writing, they become real. It's one thing to have a tradition and a culture. That's important. But it's also important for people to be able to look in the manual, to go online, to look at their company guidelines and say, what did we say about this in the past? And to ask yourself, is that right? Is it good enough? Is it specific enough? Because when we put things in writing, it makes them come real. So it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to say, here it is. So we've got things like the workforce transfer guideline. I talked to you about that. One company taking a contract, winning a contract, bidding on a contract, or just negotiating a new contract. Another company right now, what kind of information is appropriate and what is appropriate with respect to the manner in which employees maybe can stay with the customer but not stay with the agency. Providing service during a labor dispute. There are two provinces in Canada, Quebec and British Columbia, where it is against the law to provide temporary workers and replacement workers during a legitimate collective bargaining strike. And the federal government has made it illegal to provide temps to create new jobs or to replace workers on strike. There's a bunch of things that can happen. For example, some contract workers can be hired under a contract that's going to last for 2 years to build a thing for the federal government. And they come through an agency or through a supplier. And they come to work every day and they sit at a desk and they answer the phone and they do their thing while they're working there. And they seem like they're regular employees because they sit amongst regular employees, but they're working on a project and they're not unionized employees. And then the union goes out on strike. Those people can still come to work every day because it's not a new job being created. that might have otherwise been created as a union job. And it's not a union job with a replacement worker. So it can get confusing, but it is against the law to create a new job or to create a replacement, send a replacement worker. And in the world, they call them scab labor or scab workers. And of course, unions have done that to make it sound really bad. But in most provinces, it's not against the law to provide replacement workers. Very often, unions can wield the reason unions were created was because employers wield an incredible amount of autonomy and power, and it was supposed to balance the power of negotiating so that the workers had, if they collectively together supported each other, that they could also negotiate fairly with the man, with the big power of the company. But unions have now got the power to shut companies down and cause irreparable harm. And so most provinces say, hey, look it's okay that a company continues to operate and gets things done while there's a labor dispute. And so some companies use temps. And so we've got some guidelines on how that's supposed to be done fairly and openly and honestly and safely. We have got some guidelines about determining the right of referral. So two agencies present the same candidate for the same job. Who gets the fee if they hire the person? Headhunting for staffing professionals. So we've got recruiting recruiters. We talked a little bit about that. Compliance with the Competition Act. We'll talk a little bit about that. Assignment completion dates, having those specified so that we know when a contract is over, when a person's given notice of completion, whether or not they've given proper notice of termination. So assignment completion dates is an important thing. And then there's other issues around workplace hazardous materials in the workplace and who is responsible for that, whether it's the client or the agency. And of course, we've got discriminatory orders that we talked about, having a written policy around that always helps to clarify things. And then, of course, we've got our application forms that are in writing or online. And we can find a lot of the written content about these recommended business practices on the Access website. And some of these things you need to have be logged in as a member using your username. If you work for a member company, which you do because you're here, and you don't have a login, then you can contact Jennifer and you can ask her to create a login for you, and then you can get access to some of the things behind the scenes on the Access website. So managed service providers. Here's something on the Access website that was created in 2024. Access members are expected to present the highest standards and professionalism in the staffing industry and adherence to fairness, integrity, common sense, respect, sound business practices, so on. To ensure the professionalism with a managed service provider, an MSP partnership, the following procedures are recommended. So a managed service provider is when there is an agency, a staffing service company we call them the MSP, they're the primary service provider, and the customer wants that agency to be responsible for other staffing services. So everybody's got to come through the managed service provider so that the customer is not dealing with 10 services. So if the managed service provider, handles 70% of the jobs filled, but they don't have the capacity or just the ability to always fill 100% of the jobs, and they have to have sub-suppliers, then, we want to have some guidelines around that. So number one, fee terms, payments, terms, etc., should be discussed and documented to avoid misunderstanding. So we don't want to have the customer thinking one thing's happening, the managed service supplier thinks something else, and you're a sub-supplier and you think something else. We want to have that all in writing. A documented vendor fee should be on file at all participating organizations. So in other words, sometimes you have to you charge what you charge, but the managed service provider gets 3% or gets 2% or 1% or 6%. And so that um, clearly visible and documented what that fee is. A documented markup should be on file. So if the arrangement says, hey, as the primary supplier, you're allowed to mark it up at 45%, and as a sub supplier, you have to mark it up at 40%, then that should be documented so that people know. Pay rates must be discussed and not deemed to be collusion. So if for whatever reason I said, hey, everybody goes there and needs to make $23 an hour in this particular role at this particular level, we can't have different people making different wages. That creates a whole bunch of problems. You can mark it up however you want to mark it up, or you can manage your costs in many other ways. But in order for people to come here, everybody makes the same wages. Well, some people said, well, that's collusion. That's, but on the yes, it is. It's kind of, sort of, but it's one of those things too, also, where if companies are using low wages, we pay a lower wage than somebody else. And so therefore we can be more competitive. Well, that's putting the success of organizations, customers, and suppliers on the backs of workers unfairly who don't have the opportunity to influence that. Or it could be high wages. We will pay, twice the amount of anybody else, and we'll dominate the marketplace because we'll pay twice the amount of everybody else. And then all the employees of the company want to quit their jobs because they can make twice as much as a contractor. These are all unintended consequences of having wages as a competitive factor in a closed business environment where there's one supplier or two suppliers or sub-suppliers. So we try not to treat wages as a competitive point in a managed service provider, MSP environment. In an open environment, that's a different thing altogether. You want to pay competitive wages and higher wages to attract people, and you want to charge the customer lower to attract customers. And, this is an open market, but an MSP is a closed environment where a lot of unfairness can take place. Discussions that take place in a vendor neutral or MSP environment may include pay rates, markups, business processes, and other relevant program details. And this is transparent discussion is also not considered collusion. So in a vendor neutral MSP, this is when the software and the tools and the process don't give priority to any vendor. So sometimes in an MSP, the primary vendor has priority. And sometimes in what they call a vendor neutral environment, everybody is treated the same. And so, we want to say that because it's a closed environment where only 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever suppliers have been pre-vetted, that having conversation, once you get to that point in time, it's no longer collusion if you're working with each other inside the closed environment to make sure it works properly. So pay rates, markups, and business processes can all become the same, and it's not considered to be a violation of a collusion law because it's a closed environment where the deal was already done. And so it's not influencing markets. Suppliers are expected to fulfill customer and MSP vendor neutral requirements in good faith. So this means, for example, what would be an example? Master vendor doesn't distribute the open orders to the sub-suppliers until 11 o'clock at night, and then reports to the customer that the sub-suppliers all have a 1% fill rate when the master vendor has a 99% fill rate. And so therefore the sub-suppliers are terrible and should never be considered as a primary supplier in the future. So that would be unfair business practices, and so you want to have openness in that conversation. So that's the good faith portion. Number 7, MSP vendor neutral providers are expected to maintain confidentiality throughout the process. So in a vendor neutral environment, somebody knows um, and has access to the information to when the orders went out, who the orders got filled by, what the names of the temps and the contractors are, what the bill rates are. So if there's an MSP, a master service provider, who has access to all that information, they need to keep that confidential and not provide it to the other vendors inside the system. Confidentiality must be maintained, protect all parties. So the biggest concern that suppliers often have about an MSP is that your competitor knows everything about you, the names of your employees, how much you charge, what you're good at, what your fill rates are. And so the notion of vendor neutrality really, really needs to be neutral. So workforce transfer often takes place when, listen, it can take place in a really incredibly unfair way, and it can take place in a really incredibly fair way. So let's talk about let's just get the unfair way out of the way. So one company's got a bunch of temps or contractors working there at a customer. The customer goes out to another supplier, or another supplier comes into the customer and says, hey, give us all the information. Tell us about everything, who they are, how much they get paid, what work they do, how many hours they work. And then we'll transfer them all over to and we'll give them all a 10-cent raise, and we'll cut your wages by your rates by 5%. And we don't have to do any work. We don't have to do any recruiting. We don't have to do any vetting. We don't have to do anything. We're just going to be pay bill, pay bill, pay bill from tomorrow, because everything's going to be handed to us on a silver platter, but you'll be better off and we'll be better off. So let's collaborate together, coercively work together to unfairly cause harm to your legitimate primary supplier and move them all over here. That would be a bad workforce transfer. That would be a violation of their contracts. It would be a tortious interference. People would be civilly liable, probably a violation of all kinds of privacy laws, violation of employment standards with respect to the disclosure of information. The list could go on. Now, in a good scenario, ABC company, big bank, goes out to tender. They publicly or government goes out to tender. They allow companies to qualify to become bidders. They go through a process. They vet it, and the people have to be financially qualified and be in business and have a certain number of employees and a certain amount of insurance. And then they go to tender about business processes and prices. And somebody has the contract, but they've known for 5 years when the contract's over, they have to go to tender to protect their turf. And they go to tender, and somebody else, a new vendor, wins the contract. So there's been, obviously, through the entire process, because there was the entire process, there's been openness and transparency. And we're now going to consider what's going to happen to those workers. The workers need to receive notice. They need to be told that your company no longer has the contract. They need to be given options about whether or not they're going to apply to the new company and hope to get a job there and work with the customer, or whether or not the pre-existing supplier is going to those people new jobs somewhere else. And a consideration of the fact that there's private and that people have the right to choose who their employer is, that there's confidential information tracks. All those things need to be taken into consideration. And at the end of the day, also people have the right to choose who the employer is going to be. So say I want to stay customer, or no, I want to stay with my agency. They've got other jobs for me somewhere else. And in some cases, they might say, hey, okay, we're going to create a MSP environment where you subcontract, all the workers get to stay with their agency and with their temporary help service and or contract service, and they get to stay until the stated end date of their assignment, because we recommend that you have a stated end date. And once that stated end date's over, it's over. And during the interim, the previous supplier is going to invoice the new supplier, and there may be fees or may not be fees, but there's all kinds of ways that these things can be handled without causing harm to the outgoing company, unfair harm, without causing harm to the workers, unfair harm, which allowing the customer to achieve their business goals and objectives in a legal and ethical way, and to allow the new supplier to conduct their business in a proper and professional manner. So we also have the question of a bona fide referral. So this is when an agency, a recruitment agency, is trying to collect a fee from a client, and they say, we presented this candidate and you now owe us a fee. So when a staffing service confirms via email or telephone that they're going to be sending a candidate over to them within the next 48 hours. So I don't know if that's enough. If the staffing service says, I'm going to send you Johnny's resume tomorrow, I don't think that's enough. The customer agrees to accept the introduction of the candidate and their resume with the staffing service. Well, that's important, that the customer says, yeah, we'll accept that resume. It hasn't been sent to us before by somebody else. And you've got the order. I've given you the order. You're an authorized supplier. So we'll accept your candidate. So that's important. Number C, the staffing services informs the candidate of the name and the location of the employer, includes the name of the individual to whom the candidate will report for an interview. So that's important. It's important that there's full disclosure, opening, and honesty, so that the candidate knows and the candidate is given authorization to present that their resume to the client. So we've got authorization from the client, we've got authorization from the employee. Number D, when the customer is informed of the candidate's name and qualifications, or resume has been sent to the employer as evidence. So basically, B said, you're allowed to submit candidates. The customer said, yep, you're allowed to submit candidates. C says, candidate, yep, you're allowed to submit my resume. D says, yeah, we got it. We got the resume. We're in receipt of it, and you're the first. You've got priority. Nobody else has sent it before. And so the answer is B, C, and D. But just telling them you're going to submit a candidate, telling a customer about a candidate, mass uploading resumes into an MSP or some procurement tool without the pre-authorization of the candidates, none of that is good. But we need to have authorization from the customer to do business, authorization from the candidate to present, clarification that you were the first. And then finally, really also, did you do anything? I mean, sometimes it's possible that two agencies can claim all of the above. They can say, we were both authorized to submit candidates. Both of us, the candidate said, yeah, you can go ahead and send it. The client accepted the resume, didn't tell you that they weren't accepting it. You got dates and times and stuff on it. Then one agency goes about scheduling all the interviews and doing the reference checks and negotiating the contract. And the other agency 6 months later finds out their candidate got hired. Then we got to ask the question, who is the bona fide agency? Was it the one who got their paperwork in place, or was it the one that did the job and got their paperwork in place? And so that scenario I just created might create a situation for the customer who failed because they authorized multiple submissions. But in reality, the candidate who had the authorizations from both the customer and the candidate presented, acknowledged the receipt, and then did all the work, is clearly entitled to the fee. The other one is questionable. Now, if it happened immediately, saying, hey, what's going on here? You gave us authorization. We got authorization to the candidate. We submitted the candidate. You accepted the candidate. We're calling you to try to set up an interview. And then we find out that you're going around us to set the interview up. Then, you want to try to get that resolved really quickly. So you don't have a question about the multiple approvals. So that's the two separate fees. Scenario number 2. Your customer calls, Call Me Contact Center is a national call center that has 40 of your temporary employees working at their primary city location. You've received 3 calls from this week from your temporary employees, very concerned, angry, why they did not get a gift card at the holiday party last week that your customer hosted. Everybody got a gift card except for the temps. You also received a call from the hiring manager asking you to deal with these employees. Their problem. They're all complaining about the gift card, and ask them to stop bothering him about the benefits and perks that you get from being an employee. They're not employees. And so let's take a look at this and make an assumption, assume that you didn't know anything about this holiday party. Because had you known about this holiday party and that everybody's got a gift card, you might have sent some gift cards too. You haven't spoken with the hiring manager for a long time, so you didn't know about the party, you didn't know about the gift cards, you didn't know about anything. So what kind of relationship do you have with your customer? You got all these 40 people working there, but you don't visit or see or engage or manage or lead or communicate for weeks, 8 weeks. You assume that everything is going well. No good news is good news. Well, that's never a good philosophy. No news is good news. And Call Me Contact Center has been your customer for 18 months. So they've been a customer for a while. But it would appear as though there's some issues with respect to who's the employer of record, which responsibilities each of these co-employers has. Should they be invited to the Christmas party? If they're being invited to the Christmas party, how are they going to be treated? Who's paying for it? Who's making sure they don't go home drunk? Who's making sure that they follow the rules? And so we need to go back to our relationship with the customer, get some of this stuff in writing, and have conversations and openly delegate responsibilities of what we call a co-employer or a two-employer or a tripartite employment relationship. Tripartite meaning 3 partners, players, the employee, and 2 employers sharing various responsibilities. So this employer of record, it's very clear under the Employment Standards Act in Ontario and in other places that the temporary staffing company, the temporary help service, the THS, is the employer of record. If there is an employer, it's the THS. They've codified it because even though there were lots of standards that exist in court cases for union things and safety things and workplace health and safety and all kinds of other, that the government said, look, let's just take the argument away and just always tell you that the THS, the Temporary Help Service, is the employer when there's an employer. Now, I say it that way. They're the when there's an employer because it's possible that a worker can have no employer, that they're a self-employed independent contractor, and neither the customer or the THS is the employer. But when an employment relationship does exist, it is always with the THS. Now, that doesn't mean that that's for employment standards. That's for who's going to pay, what rules you're going to follow, whether they're entitled to benefits and vacation pay and public holiday pay and breaks and schedules and payment. That all has to do with the Employment Standards Act. But there are other things like workplace health and safety where it's very clear that there can be two employers, that the temporary help company is going to have some responsibility with respect to ensuring that they're sending workers to a safe workplace. They can't just say, oh, they told me it was safe, so I sent them to go stand in bare feet on razor blades. You can't you can't assume that everywhere you send your workers, you are the employer, that the customer is going to take care of it. And the customer has absolute and ultimate control over the workplace and the day-to-day supervision and the equipment and the building, they can't say, not my responsibility. Those are the workers, the employees of this temporary staffing company, even though they have no control over whether or not we have a safety guard on our equipment or whether it's properly maintained. And so you can clearly have, in some aspects of law, a co-employment or a tri-impartic employment relationship. We just know with respect to who's going to pay in Employment Standards Act, it's always the THS. So we ask the question for other things, who's providing workplace health and safety? Training. Determining what these pay rates are going to be. Is it the agency or the customer telling the agency? Who counsels the employees when they show up late for work or when their performance is not good? Who coaches them and counsels them, trains them and teaches them? Who manages the workers' compensation? Who pays the premiums? Who gets the rebate? Who gets the penalty in case there's excess injuries? Who's responsible for putting them back to work again? Who is responsible for employee benefits and employee perks? That coffee card, the gift card at the Christmas party, the benefits. Who's responsible for providing those things? Who supervises the employee at the work site? Day-to-day supervision. Who's responsible for that? Who determines the length of the assignment, when it starts and when it ends? And who has the right to hire and fire? And as we look at THS, temporary help services, we ask ourselves, hey, there's different answers at different customers in different circumstances all the time. And if a court is asked with respect to workplace health and safety or workers' compensation or violations of human rights, they're going to say, okay, we recognize that the temporary help company is the employer of record for employment standards purposes, but to what degree do all parties have a responsibility and a liability that goes along with being an employer? So they look at these standards. They also look at things like the integration test. Is the person integrated into the workforce? Are they more integrated into the temporary staffing? Are they integrated into anybody's workforce? And if they are, they've got a uniform, or they've got a business card, or they've got an extension on their telephone, or they share in the schedule, in the rotating schedule with two other employees. This is determined if they're an employee at all. And then again, who is responsible for making those decisions? We asked the question about risk of economic profit and loss. So if a person comes to work every day and they get paid by the hour, regardless of whether they're asked to work and perform a duty or not, they show up, they punch in, they go there, they stand there, they wait to be told, they get paid for the first hour. Eventually they're assigned to load tires on the truck, and they load tires on the truck, and then they stand around waiting for another truck and they get paid. They have no risk of economic loss. They're not risking whether or not it was profitable to put those tires on the truck or not. The employer, the independent company, is taking a risk of having those employees stand around. They could be making money or losing money because they're paying wages to people while tires are not or are getting on the truck. So the risk of making money or losing money determines whether or not you're a company or an employee. And then the question is, whose risk? Whose employee? So we have to ask the question, are you an employee? Are you integrated into the workforce? Do you have risk of economic loss? Do you have the right to decide to work? Do you have the right to decide how to do your work? Is that Do you provide your own tools and equipment, or does the company provide your own tools and equipment? All of these will decide whether you are an employee. And once you've decided that you are an employee, whose employee are you? And so various legislation is going to be handled in various ways, even including collective bargaining. So if a worker allowed to, here's a good example, in most cases, many cases, the temporary worker is allowed to participate in a vote to determine whether or not the employees can unionize, even though the temp worker is not the employee of the customer. But maybe they can make an argument that those votes can be lockboxed, put aside, then they can fight in court as to whether or not those workers are integrated into the workforce enough that the vote should be counted, or whether they should not be counted. So we know that they're the employees of the staffing company, but there's other laws that come into play where we could have a tripartite employment relationship or a co-employment relationship, and they all can be applied in very different ways. It's expected the staffing services firm, if retaining temporary orders, remit appropriate source deductions. If you're supplying independent contractors in temporary employees' roles to have cost savings, you may end up having a short-term gain, but liable in the long term. So what this scenario says, okay, we've got some workers, we're supplying them to the customer. We didn't ask the question, are they an employee? And do they meet the normal definitions of employee? We just automatically treated them as independent contractors. And then the independent contractors didn't have remittances in play. And then 2 years later, Revenue Canada comes in and says, hey, we've got a problem here. You owe us money for Canada Pension Plan withholding that was never withheld from these employees before. So we've got some issues with respect to improperly classifying workers. Okay, so I just want to click on a couple things here. Give me 1 second. Okay, my screen is. Can somebody unmute their microphone for a second and just say, yes, Steve, I can hear you, because my screen is not telling me that you can.
Yes, we can
So,
hear you.
Looks good.
perfect. All right, great. Thank you very much. Challenges of not having somebody administering this for me while I'm clinking along here. Okay, there we go. Now it's screen's come back. Okay, so we'll talk about managing your business. We can talk about prevention and the consequences. So prevention goes into having contracts, having open discussions, not letting those 8 weeks go by, putting it in writing, making it clear in your employment agreements and in your policies and practices and procedures and in your customer agreements that what the standards are and who does what. We can manage our clients' behavior so that when we hear complaints and things about from our employees, that we step in and talk to our clients about what they should and should not be doing so they don't unwittingly or unknowingly muddy the waters. Of course, we want to manage our candidates' behaviors, and we do that again in writing and through training and through regular communication. And then we take metrics and we report to our customers and we report to our employees about what's going on. So we talked a little bit about the members only section of the website. If you're a member company and you don't have a login access, please contact Jennifer Traer. Have your members only access to access website set up. Not adhering to these access guidelines could result in a loss of credibility within the industry, clients, a liability, You could, in the example I gave, find out 2 years later that you owe Canada Pension Plan or unemployment insurance withholding or employer's health tax. There's a common one. The employer's health tax people and the payroll tax people come in and do an audit and say, oh my goodness, these people, you're going to have to pay us 1.95% or 1.5% of their wages for the last 2 or 5 years. Loss of business ownership. In some cases, it can be so severe that you can actually lose your business. You can force you into bankruptcy or close you down. You can lose clients. Certainly have a loss of talent in your business by your employees not wanting to work for you because you don't adhere to the laws. You could have injuries because it was confusing as to who was going to provide the safety training, the safe equipment, the safe workplace. And so we could have injuries. There have even been deaths of temporary staffing workers who were sent to clients' places of business that were either unsafe or just a tragic accident. There was a tragic accident that might have been avoided, and in some cases should have been avoided. There was even a case a decade ago or so where one temporary staffing company had workers being driven to work in a company van. So the supplier had a company van and drove around and picked people up and delivered them to their workplace. And they went across a level crossing and got hit by a train, only to find out they didn't have the proper insurance. The workers were confused as about whose workers they were and whether or not whether they were at work at the time. Do you consider getting into the company van and going from the subway station or the bus stop is that at work? Are you under the direction, control, and supervision of your employer at the time? So there's all kinds of crazy, unforeseeable things that can happen. And by staying in line, putting things in writing, having good and open communication, we can avoid some of these happening. So here's an interesting case of Denny's restaurant in Alberta. So Denny's restaurant used the temporary foreign worker program along with a company to help them recruit the temporary foreign workers. And they were all brought into Canada and given housing and given promises of work. And a lot of the promises that were made when these people were recruited through the staffing company were not kept. And they were eventually awarded a settlement of $1.4 million that was distributed amongst the workers. So this goes back a decade. And the reason why we go back a decade is because we often talk about the first case. Often when there's a precedent case established, we use that one as the example to say this is the rule now that we're going to go forward with. And so this has been where a lot of the new rules that are in place and a lot of the decisions in place came from. So it was the first class action suit brought on behalf of temporary workers. There were 70 of them. They were working at Denny's restaurant in British Columbia. I said Alberta, sorry, British Columbia. The workers alleged that they paid thousands of dollars in fees to the agency. So they paid the agency to get the opportunity to come to Canada and work at Denny's. And Denny's failed to provide the amount that were promised in terms of work and schedules and reimbursements of expenses and so on. They alleged breach of contract, breach of fiduciary duty, and an unjust enrichment. In other words, Denny's and the agency got unfairly profitable by taking advantage of the workers. And again, I know that for those people that are on the call before, fiduciary duty, in layman's terms, is when a party, one of the parties, is given a significant amount of responsibility to care for someone or something. So in this particular case, these foreign workers didn't know where they were going to live. They didn't know the systems in the process here. And they trusted their caregiver, the temporary staffing firm, and Denny's to act in their best interest and to do what was right was legal and lawful and appropriate and fair and to uphold their part of the agreement. And they had an incredible amount of power and authority in this caring responsibility. So we might say, for example, that the CEO of a company who is responsible for making decisions to look after their finances had a fiduciary duty to its shareholders to act in their behalf. We might say that a nanny looking after children on behalf of a mom and dad who go to work every day and lives in the house and helps dress and feed and get the kids to school safely, that they've got a fiduciary duty to care for the children. And once a person is deemed to be a fiduciary, or a party in agreement is deemed to be a fiduciary, then they're held to a higher standard than just two blokes two people. One person is the retail clerk in the store, the other one is buying a pair of jeans. Neither one of them is a fiduciary of anybody over anything. One of them comes to work every day and knows little or nothing about the jeans, except for they cost $29.99 and they have size stickers on it. And the buyer has no responsibility to anyone except for to buy their jeans. And so when the jeans don't fit or fall apart or something, then no one can claim that the other party was a fiduciary and they had a higher level of standard they had to adhere to. So we always, when we hear about a fiduciary duty, we talk about this combination of responsibilities that are a higher level of care. Now, as the workers maintained that Denny's was trying to intimidate them from participating in a lawsuit. So once they got together and tried to create this class action suit, Denny's like, oh, you do that and we won't give you a raise or you can't work here anymore. And so that's against the law. So this led to the court to give an order that there'd be no repercussions. So if somebody actually even signed a document that said, I'm out, I don't want to have anything to do with this, that when it came time for settlement, they were in. So if there were 70 employees and 50 of them said, I'm out, the court said, you can't get out. Yeah, you can, if the parties win, you win. So there's no advantage for you saying you're out because we're all going to be treated equally regardless. And that was because Denny's was accused of and found to be guilty of intimidating the workers to not participate. Approximately a quarter of them opted out of the lawsuit, raising the question of whether they did so out of fear of retribution from Denny's. So this led to the court order. The court noted that the temporary workers were particularly vulnerable, and all opt-out employees were included in the settlement, and that those promised 30, they were promised 35 and a half to 40 hours per week or paid for any shortages. So some of the workers were promised full-time jobs and they only worked part-time. So they had to recalculate what they would have made had they worked 37 to 40 hours a week, and they got paid the difference. They were reimbursed for their airfare to Canada. They were all forced to pay on their own for their airfare, or it was deducted from their wages. So they got their money back. They were reimbursed for their agency fees. So the agencies charged them fees to get the jobs, and they were given all of that money back. And then Denny's also donated a significant fund to a migrant workers organization that was intended to assist and advocate for and educate immigrant workers. So when we've got a client, like in this particular case, Denny's was, and any other client who participates in discrimination, and they give you discriminatory job orders, or we know that they're acting discriminatory on the work site, or that they're breaching confidentiality and they're giving out information to other suppliers or to other places, that they're providing false information. The example I gave you earlier about them saying the job was this when they knew it was that, so they could get people at a lower wage, or false information about the safety of the work site, or the financial credibility of the organization and their ability to pay their bills and their wages when the time comes around, for not paying their fees placement fees, um, giving out multiple exclusive contracts, saying, hey, if you give me a discount and you charge me 19% of the salary for a placement fee, I'll give it to you exclusively. Okay. Hey, if you give me a 19% fee and you give me a discount, I'll give it to you exclusively. Sign the contract. So you know that there's clients out there signing multiple exclusive contracts or providing promises that they can't keep in order to negotiate wages down. So these are the kinds of things we need to be aware of and talking to our customers about to make sure that we don't fall prey to these and allow our customers to get away with those kind of behaviors. And that comes through open engagement and communication and written contracts. Managing our candidates as if they were employees of employer of record. So when a customer treats your employee the same as their employee, they muddy the waters in this co-employment tripartite employment relationship. Requesting screening when it's not mandatory for their own employees. So if they say, hey, you can't send people here unless you do a blood alcohol test or drug testing, but they don't ask their own employees to do that, then we want to engage with them to try to improve that. Communicating with your candidates employees about a workforce transfer. Talked a lot about workforce transfer. These are the kinds of things that we can do to try to manage unethical behavior. But we also have sometimes people in our own organizations, people that we hire, maybe even a business partner, um, um, that are acting in unethical ways. And so discrimination, choosing to work on clients' discriminatory orders, using personal information illegally, lack of concern, sending people to unhealthy, unsafe environments in the workplace, not doing your due diligence, not going and inspecting workplaces, breach of client contracts, and knowing that I know of one particular company that recently went out of business that in the months leading up to them going out of business, they had some financial trouble, that they were making promises to clients that the workers knew they could not keep. They knew they couldn't keep those promises, and they were going to breach the contract, but they were trying to get the contracts so that they could stay in business. These are things that we can manage internally. Breach of confidentiality of candidates, misrepresenting candidates to your clients, recruiting from your clients, restricting the candidates to make a choice of employment and causing them to have fear so they can't make choices about where they can work. These are all things that we can manage inside our own business. Things like recruiting from our customers, using our memberships and access to deriving income through charging fees to candidates and to employees, being deceitful with candidates about clients and about their reputation and about their work environment and about their jobs, stealing anything in any way, whether it's information or other things, not declaring employees as appropriately for as employees and treating them as independent contractors. Just aggressive, offensive tactics with employees. These are all things that we can do. And we can do our research and into people's previous employment, and we can do our job references, and we can create job descriptions and company policies and employment standards, and we can do all of these things, put them in our training plans to get ready. We can document it in a way that we write it down, because as I mentioned earlier, when we write it down, it becomes more real. And then we need to constantly keep our eyes open and be aware of what's going on around us and not take the view that no news is good news, or that didn't seem to blow up in our face, so it must be okay. That's just not the way we handle things. So your employer is working with a customer on a 6-month assignment, and a week before the assignment ends, the employee applies to an internal job with the customer. And you only hear about this when your client calls you to say that our employee went through the back channel to get in front of another hiring manager. This is acceptable behavior as your candidate only has a few days left on this specific job order. Is this acceptable behavior or unacceptable behavior? And the answer is, yeah, it depends. I mean, it was a 6-month assignment. We know that at the end of 6 months in Ontario, um, it's illegal to charge a fee anyways. And so, well, if the candidate talked to us about it and we're coming up to the 6 months, were we going to do anything with it? Were we going to help the candidate get the job and not charge a fee for it? Were we going to hurt the candidate's chances of getting the job so that we could keep them working for us at another customer on another job site? Were we going to try hurt the candidate's chances by trying to go get the job order from the other department and fill it with one of our other candidates? And we're going to use this confidential information to cause harm to them for our own benefit. What were we going to do with this information? How were we going to handle it? And so the answer is, yeah, is it an end run? Uh, I don't know. Is it an end run? Maybe it would have been nice that our relationship was so good with the candidate and the candidate trusted us and we were so trustworthy that the candidate would say, hey, my assignment's over. My 6-month assignment is over. And they're thinking about hiring somebody doing exactly the same thing right across the hall. Would you put a good word in for me? Can I get a reference from you? And we said, yeah, sure. And we write them a reference. Well, it would be wonderful that that's the way it was. And we wrote the reference and they presented the reference and they got the job. And then you've now got another happy person working for your customer who might actually have the opportunity to influence who their suppliers are going to be in the future. That would be nice. So is it wrong that they did an end run? No, not so much, because it was 6 months. If it was 6 weeks into a 6-month assignment, then yeah, you want to have a conversation with your employees because they're your employees. And you want to say to them, when you act in a particular way, you cause harm to the reputation of our company. We didn't send you there so that you could disrupt their normal business practices and use the information you gain internally in order to benefit yourself when they don't want you to do that. If you want to apply for a job internally and it's only 6 months into it, 6 weeks into it, contact us. We'll give you advice. We'll act on your behalf. We'll try to figure out how we work forward to this so that it doesn't cause harm to our business relationship with the customer in a manner that also doesn't cause harm or maybe benefits you. So there's a different approach to everything. Nothing's absolutely right or wrong. We have temps and employees, people who apply to us, who fib on their applications. You know, at a conference in Montreal for an Access conference last May, there was this really interesting conversation about AI and how my AI competes against your AI, about how the staffing services AI is being used to try to determine the credibility of the applicant's legitimacy, the accuracy, the honesty of the information that they're providing. And the candidate's AI is helping them write their resume. And it's writing resumes in a way that are intended to match up with your job posting, saying all kinds of things that maybe they can't do or haven't done, or an exaggeration or something. And so the battle of AI. So we've got candidates who can misrepresent their skills, their credentials, and experience. They can misrepresent their previous salaries and their requirements to be employed and their availability. They can fib to you about why they're available, not available, what they're doing when they're not available. They can use recruiters for bargaining. They can use you to try to get you to figure out how much you would offer them or one of your customers would offer them to move so they can go back and seek a counteroffer from their current employee. They can have candidates who fail to follow through on their commitment and they might say to you, yeah, I'll show up, or yeah, I'll do that, or yeah, I'll present you with this information, or yeah, I'll get that. And they don't do it. So they could fail to follow through on their promises and obligations. And they can circumvent the agency and go right around you and go straight to the client. So these are all things that we need to be aware of, and we need to build systems and processes so it systemically considers the fact that these are the things that our business model is trying to prevent. That we, our employees are more likely to be honest because we went through this vetting process. Our employees' credibility with respect to their previous experience is more likely to be a perfect match or a good match to your job because we went through these regular business process to ensure that that's what they actually did and did well on their job. So it's all about us creating a recurring, repeatable, standardized, documented business process to understand that these are the kinds of things, including false references, that we're trying to avoid. We have a complaints process in Access that if you believe that another Access member company is violating a code of ethics, then then you need to make a submission of a complaint to Access within a certain period of time. The Access has got some commitments to look into it informally before they take formal action. You can have conversations with the executive director in confidence about what you think another member company might be doing or is doing. Access will have to take a consideration on, with the information provided to them, to what degree they're going to intervene. Of course, they can't really officially intervene unless a member makes a complaint to Access in writing. Otherwise, it's just hearsay and rumors. And so if somebody's going to take up the time to contact us, say, hey, this member company is paying less than minimum wage, and we're competing against them unfairly in the workplace because they're paying people less than minimum wage, and that would be a violation of Access Code of Ethics and Standards. And of course, we would expect you to confidentially put that complaint in writing so that Access could then take an action and say, go to the company, maintaining your confidentiality, and say to the company, hey, we've got an obligation. Is there any truth to this? And try to deal with it in an informal way. If it's found that there is likely to be a violation of the code of ethics and the company does not respond in a positive way to resolve the problem, then the executive director has got an obligation to has got an obligation to raise that with a subcommittee within the board of directors who are kept also required to keep information confidential so that they can determine what the course of action will be. I will say this, that as far as I know, I think this is true. I'm almost certain this is true. That no member company has ever lost their membership and been asked to leave the association because of a violation of ethics. This is for two reasons. One is it's highly unlikely that an ethical intended company would come to Access and join because we're all about ethics. This is what we have a code of ethics and standards that everyone has to adhere to and make a commitment to adhere to. And so most people have the finest of intentions. Secondly, because most companies have the finest of intentions, doesn't mean that they don't make mistakes or do things unwittingly or unknowingly that are inappropriate. And in literally 100% of the cases, when it is found that there has been a violation of what might have been considered to be an ethical business practice, unethical business practice, the companies have pretty much said, oh my goodness, I didn't know. I didn't know that we were doing that, or I didn't know that that was illegal, or I didn't know that we didn't change that when we changed everything else 5 years ago. And when it's brought to their attention, they take action and prove that they've taken action to be compliant. So, having open and honest communication to the association and from the association has resulted in tremendous outcomes. And it's encouraged by all member companies to participate in that process. So the procedure for a complaint must be submitted in writing to the Access Executive Director. The Executive Director will acknowledge receipt of the complaint and refer the complaint to the Ethics Committee within 7 days. And within that 7-day period, the Executive Director will attempt to informally resolve the problem, keeping the complainant's identity confidential. So as we move in towards the end of our last 15 minutes, we're going to talk about a couple other little things. One is insurance. You're going to see in your contracts with your customers the requirement for various degrees and levels of insurance. So we often hear about commercial general liability. This is what I call the Wile E. Coyote insurance. You know, that do you have insurance in case the anvil falls off the shelf and lands on somebody's head? And this would be not for an employee injured at work, but a customer or a visitor or something. Somebody slips on the ice out in front of your building that you're the jerk, Steve Martin in The Jerk, and you create glasses that cause a person to stare at the thing on the bridge of the nose, and everybody becomes cross-eyed. You would have to have insurance for that, commercial general liability insurance that would insure you against these strange things, and very often that you're going to get sued for. And if you're found responsible for the damages that were caused, usually commercial general liability is the insurance that you want to help cover those things. Now, there are certain aspects of commercial general liability that over the years have been removed from the CGL insurance contracts and have been created as either separate insurance or separate endorsements. So, for example, property insurance for fire, water damage, and theft of the property, somebody breaking in and stealing stuff, or the place burning down, or the pipes breaking, or the roof leaking and everything getting flooded. These types of insurance are often a separate policy, or they're endorsements that are added on to the CGL insurance because they're so unique and special. CGL insurance has realized that we need to address those things separately. And fire insurance can be really complicated because you could, say, for example, be in an office tower and have a fire in your location causing damage to people in other locations. So you need to have proper insurance for these sorts of things. Errors and omissions insurance. There are two types of errors and omission insurance in our business. One I call agency, errors and omissions insurance agency, and others errors and omission insurance contractors. So first off, agencies. So the agency errors and omissions insurance is where you're insured for your owners, the company, and sometimes executives and directors. We'll come back to that. Where you do something in error by mistake or forget to do something that causes harm to somebody else. Now, in the process of performing your business. So, as an agency in the recruitment business, it's highly unlikely that this is going to happen. So it's really inexpensive and widely misunderstood, whereas people get errors and omission insurance for nearly nothing, for low cost. They advertise or tell their customers that they have E&O insurance and to cover $1 million or something, and on we go, only for people to find out later that agency errors and omission insurance doesn't cover the kinds of things that the customer was hoping or thought it should. So customers don't know how to word it. So their contracts are vaguely worded. Insurance companies know what they're selling, so they take advantage of selling things cheap to people that don't actually have any claims. And buyers buy it because they think that they're fulfilling the obligation of a contract that the customer demanded they have in order to win the contract. So they're buying a criteria to qualify. In other words, they're buying E&O insurance. So say, for example, Steve is a engineer and he's an electronics engineer. And there's another Steve who is a civil engineer, both candidates of the same name and similar backgrounds and so on, but one's electronics and the other is civil. The customer is looking for a civil engineer and they send over the resume of Steve, the electronics engineer, because they have the same name. And but they send over the candidate, whatever. They get identities mixed up. And so Steve shows up and he gets, they sent over the resume of the Steve, the civil engineer, but they send the candidate, Steve, the civil engineer, for the interview. And they really like Steve, the civil engineer. I assume he knows how to build bridges. But they really find out their kids play in the same baseball team and all kinds of things and went to the same school. And so next thing you know, Steve, the electronics engineer, gets hired to build and design bridges. And of course, the bridge falls down because he doesn't know how to build bridges. And they realize, oh my goodness, this person is not the same Steve. He's the electronics engineer, Steve, not the civil engineering, Steve. No wonder this building fell down. Let's sue the agency for sending the wrong Steve. This errors and omission insurance for agency would cover that because it was an error committed in the performance of the duties of which you charge fees for, of your business, your primary objective. You made a mistake. It was an honest mistake. The likelihood of that happening is somewhere between never and never. And so they sell you insurance that you're never going to use and it's never going to cover anything. And so it's really inexpensive. Beware of the errors and omissions insurance agency. Be practical and maybe looking for other types of more realistic examples that it might cover that might happen to you to determine whether or not you're getting any value out of that agency errors and omissions insurance policy. And also understand that some customers in their contracts are going to require that you have that insurance, and you're going to know it's silly, but you're going to go out and spend $1,000 and get the policy and submit the certificate and win the contract, and it's never going to come into play because the contract never specified what the errors and omissions were supposed to cover, and you're basically purchasing a checkbox on the list in order to be a vendor with that client. So be it. Then there's errors and omissions contractors, which is different and more likely that this is what the customer really wants. They want to know that if the contractor comes in to perform some IT work and accidentally uploads the wrong thing and creates an opening in their security system and someone breaks into the bank electronically and steals $1 million or $100 million, that they're going to say, wait a minute, that IT contractor made an error in his work. He made an omission in his work, causing us to have a huge loss. We're going to sue the contractor. We're going to sue the agency for the mistake that he made. And now this isn't an error committed by the agency. This is an error committed by the contractor. And that's worth insuring. That you're going to send somebody over to somebody's place, they're going to do some work and they're going to do it poorly or do something bad, and you've got insurance to cover that workmanship. So contractors insurance, errors and omission insurance is valuable. Sometimes uh, some brokers have got very big programs where they actually sell the insurance to the contractor, and the contractor has to prove to the client and to the agency they have it. Sometimes the agency gets it to cover the contractor and supplies the certificate to the customer. So there's a difference between E&O agency and E&O contractor. Make sure you understand which one they're looking for. Then there's directors' liability insurance. And so these are people who are on the board of directors who are maybe not there from day to day, or the owners of the company are not there day to day making decisions about whether or not you should put a thing on the door, shovel the snow, or give alcohol to people at your Christmas party. And yet when something like bad happens and everybody gets sued, the directors and officers get sued along with the corporation and maybe the worker who did the work. And so you want to have directors liability insurance, so that people will agree to be a director on your board of directors with your company. Theft and law and dishonesty insurance is different than the commercial general liability insurance. We're almost there, guys. Commercial general liability insurance that has got theft in it, or a property theft. Somebody breaks in and steals your stuff. There's a different kind of theft where your employees steal from your customers. This is a third party. It's not insuring you for having stuff stolen from you, where the person had a manifest intent to cause harm to you. This is where the employee, one of your employees or one of your contractors, steals from your customer, in which case the insurance up at the top under property insurance and theft would not cover that, because the loss was to the customer. So the customer is going to experience a loss. Somebody stole from them. They're going to sue you because your employee stole from them. Leather treaty type of thing that we talked about earlier. And so in earlier times, more of a British term, they called this bonding. They would say, are your employees bonded? And what that meant was that you've gone through a vetting process to hire people. Then you've got insurance that if they go onto your work site or into your home and they steal from the customer, that there's insurance to cover that. It's a bonded employee. So back in the 70s and before, the 80s, 90s, before, you did it on almost an employee by employee basis, until eventually you started to realize there's these industries that are going to have big policies to cover lots of people. So there's theft and dishonesty insurance policies covering all of your employees who might steal from all or any of your customers. And sometimes you can have those customers named. So you can say this bonding or this dishonesty and theft insurance is only for ABC company. Because when you signed the contract, they said you have to have $2 million worth of theft and dishonesty insurance. So you go out and get theft and dishonesty insurance from your agent, from your broker, and they deal with the insurance company saying, yeah, this is only to cover this customer, this bank, or this government, or this place. And so the cost of the insurance is lower because it doesn't cover you with every customer everywhere. It only covers you with the named, additionally named insured. If it's named insured, it's you, and then additionally named insured is the customer. And then you can have obviously other special insurances such as medical malpractice insurance in case your contractors or workers go out there and they do the wrong thing. You can have caregiver abuse insurance, where you might have people acting as nurses or caregivers, or people going into people's homes, transporting people, and they're behaving badly. You can have automobile insurance for your cars that you own or lease in the business. And then you can have non-owned automobile insurance. This is where your contractors are driving their cars, or your contractors, your employees, are driving your customers' vehicles. So your employees are going to have primary insurance on their car, their truck. Your customer is going to have primary insurance on their car, your truck. Your driver, during the course of work, gets into the employee's car or into the customer's car, is involved in an accident, and then the lawsuits start and they sue the owner of the car, which is insured, the driver of the car, which is not the owner of the car, it's your employee, and you, your company, because you supplied that driver to drive that car. And so you need to have this non-owned automobile insurance that piles on top of the basic insurance on the vehicle, so that because the vehicle owner's insurance is not going to cover you. It's going to cover them. It's not going to cover you. Of course, we have got workers' compensation insurance, and that it's intended so that workers cannot sue you for injuries that occur in your workplace. It is intended to define how, when an injury occurs in the workplace without going to court, it's going to be handled. And I talked about the term additionally insured, which is the difference between named insured. And the terms joint and several, you'll hear the terms joint and several, meaning that you can indemnify or be liable. Indemnify, which means that we're going to protect them with the insurance, or they could be liable, they could be responsible for damages jointly or severally, which means if it's jointly, that the two parties that committed the problem, participated in the problem, causing the damage, that they can share in the damage, in taking responsibility for and paying for the damages, or severally, which means each one is treated individually. And so you will hear the term joint, you'll hear the term several, and you will hear the term joint and several. So there we are for insurance, and we are 4:01, only 1 minute overdue. That is our presentation for business practices and ethics for today. We cover a lot in a short period of time. Please feel free to stay on the line, demute, unmute your microphones, ask me any questions. You gotta go, that's okay too. Also, my email address, you can send it to Steve, Steve, .jones, Jones, at bell.net. And you can send me an email, and you can ask me a question. If it's confidential, I'm not going to share it with anybody. If it's a really great question, I'll reword it and share the answers with different people, so that without disclosing your company information. If I said something wrong, you need clarity, I'll provide that also back to Access so that we can provide clarity to everybody. But please feel free, when it comes to the things we talked about here today, or any other CPC lesson that you take that I'm the facilitator, to reach out to me directly. We're here to help. We want to help, and we truly appreciate you having the professionalism and taking the time to take the session today and to make the move towards the certified personnel consultant designation. And that's it for today. So I'm going to hang on the line for anybody who wants to stick around. And if I don't hear from you, then I'm going to assume we're all good.